On the 24th of October 1917, Lenin returned by train to St. Petersburg and took personal charge of the revolution. Stalin had failed to grasp the pace of events, and throughout this crucial period spent his time behind his desk at the offices of Pravda. Later feature films rectified this blemish, placing Stalin at Lenin's side throughout. On the 26th of October 1917, the Winter Palace, the final bastion of the provisional government, was stormed. In the civil war which followed, Lenin relied on Stalin to do his dirty work.
There were no moral thresholds for Stalin, and Lenin knew about this. He promoted Stalin. He knew what sort of person, or he thought he knew what sort of person he was. He gave him all of the dangerous troubleshooting roles after the October Revolution in the Civil War. If there was a problem on one of the Civil War fronts, the man to send there was Stalin.
As Lenin's enforcer, Stalin seemed to have found his role. It was only in the chaos following the First War that Hitler found his. Germany's defeat in 1918 was a devastating blow for him. He heard the news while in hospital after being gassed.
I had not wept since the day I stood at my mother's grave, but now I couldn't help it. What was all my pain compared with this misery?
Defeat now gave Hitler the strongest characteristic he was to share with Stalin, an overwhelming sense of political mission.
Hatred grew in me, hatred for those responsible for this deed. In the days that followed, my own fate became known to me.
He took Germany's defeat so personally. I mean, many people did, of course, feel a sense of personal loss. But Hitler, having drifted so long in his early life, suddenly had this extraordinary desire, I think, to marry himself to Germany, his German history, and to Germany's future, and gradually began to develop the idea that he alone was able to bridge this divide between this sort of sense of personal, deep personal loss and the salvation of Germany.
Hitler, like millions, sought scapegoats everywhere. He blamed Marxists, Jews, democratic politicians. He was Germany's misery made flesh. In 1919, he found a home and a voice in the extreme right German Workers' Party in Munich. From the very first, he electrified with his oratory, despite his Austrian accent. He had always suspected he had a talent for rhetoric. Now it was confirmed. "I could speak," he said. He began in committee rooms and beer halls. The effect was always the same. "Goodness, he's got a gob on him," the leader of the Workers' Party said. "We could use him."
Mein Vater hat Hitler das erste Mal sprechen gehört. Das war 1920 im Steiner Gebäude.
My father heard Hitler speak for the first time in a Munich beer keller in 1920. My mother told me that he came home in high spirits. He was usually depressed, but had shaken off his depression. He said that he had met the man who would lead Germany to greatness once again.
Spellbound by Hitler's oratory, many thousands joined the fledgling party, and in less than a year Hitler had made it his own. He used all his artistic skills to create the party's image, introducing the heraldry of the swastika and the array of banners and symbols which would later reach their apotheosis at the Nuremberg rallies. He translated his own bitterness into the party's ideology, railing against enemies within and without, socialists, communists, Jews and capitalists who had worked together to destroy Germany. And he insisted on complete obedience to himself as Führer, the leader. Hitler was Nazism, and Nazism was Hitler. It was an extraordinary transition for the man who only 10 years before had been a homeless wastrel.
Both Stalin and Hitler, of course, were outsiders. Stalin was a Georgian, and Hitler, of course, was an Austrian, a point I think that is so often overlooked when one talks about the impact of Hitler on Germany. But they were, in that sense, like Napoleon, outsiders who had something to prove. They cut themselves off from their roots, and in that kind of rootless situation, had to tie themselves to something else. Stalin tied himself to Lenin's revolution. Hitler tied himself to the salvation for the German people.
By 1923, Hitler was confident enough to try to seize power in Munich by means of a putsch, a violent coup. It was a fiasco. As Hitler and his stormtroopers marched into the Odeonplatz, they were fired on. Contrary to later Nazi propaganda, Hitler fled, suffering a dislocated shoulder, and took shelter in his press officer's house.
He took out a pistol and said, "They shan't take me alive." And my mother then slowly talked to him, "Herr Hitler, you can't do that. Think of all the people who have believed in you and still believe in you. You cannot leave them in the lurch this way." And having talked along this line, she got up to him and quietly took away the pistol and dropped it into a great bin of flour.
Hitler was imprisoned in Landsberg jail near Munich. Once again he suffered intense depression after the failure of the putsch. But his sentence gave him the opportunity to set out his personal vision in a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle.
It tells us a great deal, not just about Hitler's geopolitics or his racism, which is well known, but about Hitler's general view of human nature, his view of the political process, his view of what makes societies work, how they hold together. There's no blueprint in Mein Kampf, but the general worldview that Hitler sketches there dominates his thinking right the way through to the Second World War.
Stalin, meanwhile, already had his hands on the levers of power and was seeking to tighten his grip. But in a world where Lenin was the star, he had to veil his ambition, unlike Hitler, who made a virtue of his craving for power. Lenin appreciated Stalin's mixture of cunning and ruthlessness. "That cook," he said, "will concoct nothing but peppery dishes." The skills Stalin showed in dealing with party matters led to his appointment in 1922 as General Secretary of the Communist Party, and put him in a position where he could build his power base, especially when Lenin's health failed.
In his office in the Central Committee of the party, Stalin was able to quietly select the right people who would be indebted to him for their positions, and put them in places where they would be useful to him.
In 1922, Lenin suffered the first of several strokes. Stalin had hidden his ambition so well that Lenin only now began to recognize him as a rival.
Why on earth didn't Lenin, having picked Stalin to do all of these jobs that required so much confidence, so much ruthlessness, not tumble to the possibility earlier that those qualities might be used against him? And I think the only conclusion you can draw about this is that Lenin was too arrogant to see this possibility. He never guessed that anyone that he had promoted would ever be able successfully to turn the tables on him. But Stalin did.
Paralyzed, Lenin dictated his last testament to his wife, in which he attacked Stalin for being coarse and rude, and for abusing power. Many of Lenin's comrades now saw the war commissar, Leon Trotsky, not Stalin, as the obvious successor. In January 1924, Lenin suffered his final stroke and died, giving Stalin the opportunity he had been waiting for. Now he could begin his campaign for supreme power within the Communist Party. He set himself up as the high priest of the new cult of Lenin. At the same time, he singled out his rivals for destruction. But to seek mastery in the world where all men are equal required from the first his special gift for inscrutability.